Hi, well in this film I'm going to show you some of the absolutely amazing contents from the Mary Rose, and the Mary Rose was actually a flagship of Henry VIII, and it's situated at Portsmouth, in fact just behind the Victory that you're seeing now in your pictures. And it's a time capsule of Tudor life, because inside the ship they recovered about 19,000 different objects. And because I have an interest in things like wooden bowls and leatherwork, they're wonderful examples there of both those things, plus lots of carpenter's tools and a whole wealth of other information. So I went along with a group of my bodger friends to have a look around the new museum, and it's a splendid new building. The actual museum's arranged over 3 floors like the decks of the ship, which is rather clever. Here's a model of what the Mary Rose looked like. The lowermost deck was a storage area, mainly for food and weapons, and also rigging. Then came the main deck, and that was for the guns, and then finally the upper deck, and that was where the great cabins and the officers' chests were found. Since the Mary Rose was lifted from the seabed in 1982, she's been kept sprayed with water for 12 years and then with polyethylene glycol, and at the moment she's being dried, so that's what those large black pipes are. But I hope that that will all be completed by 2017, and then there'll be better views of the actual deck structures. But it is fascinating because you can actually see the upper decks, the main decks, etc., and where they came across in the ship. On entering the exhibition area, one's immediately struck by this bell. It's a ship's bell standing in front of one, and then these massive guns on their carriages, and they really are incredibly well preserved. It's strange because the silt seemed to actually keep the wooden items intact, but a lot of the metal items totally corroded. Obviously if they're bronze they're fine, but the steel, the ferrous ones. One of the areas I particularly liked was the master carpenter's cabin, and this was one of the larger cabins on the ship. Well, in fact it was the largest, and the carpenter obviously made sure it was big enough. But they had his leather shoes there. Most of the textiles on the ship had sort of perished, but there was some sort of evidence in places of textiles. And a wonderful collection of tools, and I particularly like this tool holder, which looked a bit like an arrow quiver. But it took things like a ruler probably, and chisels and scribes and dividers, and there it is, it's at the centre of the picture. It's item number 12 there. It was coated in leather, but you can imagine that being held and having all those tools inside. And they found an old chalk line, so chalk lines are obviously still being used, and this one had actually fallen down through the ship, and it was found obviously all these years later when the ship was pulled out to sea, which is a funny thought. We all enjoyed looking at the planes and the adze and the axes, and there was such a variety, and actually most of them you could recognise from today's tools. The designers of the exhibition had very cleverly put plastic blades in all the tools, so you could actually sort of work out what they were. There's one tool which even the experts weren't certain what it was, and it looked like a little series of wooden steps. And they wondered if perhaps it was for marking out or assessing the thickness of bits of wood. But here it is, it's the one with little like saw teeth approaches on it. Perhaps it was some form of depth gauge, who knows. The carpenter's rulers were rather nice. They were placed in Tudor inches, which apparently are smaller than inches as we know them today. But they don't look unfamiliar as rulers. A lot of the hammers had just a handle only remaining, so the head had perished, which is quite odd, but they had had nails put in at some point, and one had survived because it had been bedded in pitch. But here's the actual hammer shaft, and above it is an old brace. I must say it'd be great fun to try making one of those braces. There were lots of chests found on the ship, and they had a good display of the master gunner's chest. I especially liked the crocodile-shaped, elaborately carved firing sticks called linstocks. These hold the fuse for when you ignite the gunpowder, and there's one in the back of the picture there, just in front of the chest itself. The chest actually was a nice slab construction. It had like a linfold carving design on the front of it. You get so many ideas looking around these places for sort of woodworking projects, and it is quite inspiring. It was amazing. They knew where each item had been on the ship. When they actually excavated, they numbered each plank, photographed and recorded. The cannonballs were all slightly different sizes, and they used little wooden grid discs to feed the cannonballs through to size them. Here's a close-up of one of the guns, and it's a wonderful bit of casting. I've been doing a bit of casting recently, actually, in aluminium, so it really made me appreciate what they've been doing. They found the dog on board, and it was presumably there as a rat catcher, and they carefully pieced together the skeleton of the dog. There was a surgeon on board, and they found a whole chest containing 64 various objects, including, I was quite staggered by this, a syringe. Nice wooden bowls and wooden canisters and leather water bottles, and I saw looking at these thinking, oh, they'd all be nice projects to make sometime. There are lots of different displays in the museum, and I must say one of the things that really hit me about it was items of wood and leather, everyday objects. They just haven't survived, but once the Mary Rose was raised, you suddenly found evidence about how old bowls had been turned and how leather clothes had been made and how shoes had been made. Some of the forensics or studies were very interesting as well, because you had things like an analysis of a skeleton, seeing what people's bone structures and diet was like, and where their joints had perhaps been more worn because they were, say, an archer and had been using a longbow from a young age. And they'd done some facial reconstructions on some of the skeletons to try and work out what the people may have looked like as well. I was quite impressed by this cooking range for doing broth. Fancy having a fire on a wooden ship. It was quite common though. But no, these wooden items is things like the bowls, the spoons, little things which just have not otherwise survived, and they've been perfectly preserved in a silt. And of course you can learn so much more by looking at them and seeing how they were actually made, how pole lathes were used, how many revolutions of a pole lathe to turn a wooden bowl and things like that. One of the things I liked here was a spoon. It was actually turned on a pole lathe with its handle sort of sticking out, so a slightly hazardous thing to turn on a pole lathe, but it was quite well executed. And actually the bowl lathe turning hooks were just like the ones I'd made in terms of the way they had cut. There's a lovely pepper mill there which would be great fun to try and recreate, and there were some sort of drawings of it as well. Here they are. It just worked as a sort of conical shape, forcing the peppercorns down between two walls. I especially liked this crow's nest, and it did look like a proper crow's nest with its sort of wooden slats, and you can imagine some poor soul sitting at the top 30 metres above the ship's deck there, swinging around in that rather flimsy wooden type of basket. There are some very good examples of leather shoes in the collection there, and there were the archer shoes were called turn shoes, but they were actually made by turning them inside out and putting the seams on the inside. They found a staggering number of longbows on the ship, and they cleaned up perfectly. They'd been stored in elm chests, and the yew wood just looked like it had been sort of harvested yesterday. You could see he had left the knots on the yew staves, and they were very nicely made. Here's a final high shot of the actual ship's hull, and this gives like a top-down view looking down from the top down at the ship. And there's our final shot of some leatherwork. How about that for a few more projects in the coming years? Perhaps I'll make some of those. I hope you enjoyed watching the film. I really did enjoy this exhibition. It was absolutely great, so get there if you can. Anyway, thanks for watching.